After researching disabilities and discussing developmental differences, we are now going to explore how legislation has transformed public education for students with differing abilities. This presentation is an introduction to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, initially established in 1975. IDEA continues to be revised in order to protect the civil rights of all students, parents, and educators. Prior to federal legislation passed in the mid-1970s, many schools did not provide any programs for students with disabilities, or the programs they provided were very minimal. In fact, in 1970, only 20% of all children with disabilities were served in public school programs. Until the 1970s, it was estimated that 3 million children with disabilities received inappropriate or inadequate services, while up to 1 million were totally excluded from the educational system. The only recourses available for most parents were private educational programs or programs specifically designed for handicapped students. In many cases, parents paid for these educational programs out of their own resources, and in many situations, students with disabilities stayed home and received no formal education. Some children with disabilities received services in residential programs. Typically, children with mental retardation and with sensory deficits were placed in these settings. In 1965, approximately 100,000 children from birth to 21 years old lived in institutions for people with mental retardation in the United States. While there have been significant changes in services for students with disabilities, these changes have occurred incrementally over a period of time. Since services for students with disabilities began, there have been 4 distinct phases: the relative isolation, integration or mainstreaming, inclusion, and empowerment. In the relative isolation phase, which included the first 60 to 70 years in the 20th century, students were either denied access to public schools or permitted to attend only in isolated settings. In the integration phase, which began in the 1970s, students with disabilities were mainstreamed or integrated into general education programs when appropriate. During the inclusion phase, starting in the mid-1980s, emphasis was placed on students with disabilities being included in all school programs and activities. This phase differed from the integration phase in a minor but very significant way. Although students with disabilities were in general classrooms under both integration and inclusion, in the inclusion phase it was assumed that these students belonged in general classrooms, whereas in the integration phase they were considered to be special education students who were simply placed in the general classroom part of the time, primarily for socialization. Most recently, the 4th phase of services, empowerment and self-determination, has been the focus of inclusion efforts to better prepare students for the highest degree of independence possible. While the changes in special education since the mid-1970s have been dramatic, probably the most significant change has been acceptance of the idea that special education is a service, not a place. In other words, special education is not a classroom in a building. Rather, it is a specialized instruction and services provided for students with disabilities. Take a minute and reflect on your educational journey. Have you witnessed some of these changes in the classroom? If you are currently teaching, how do you feel about the statement, special education is not a place, but a service? Since the mid-1970s, services to students with disabilities have changed dramatically. Not only are more appropriate services provided by schools, but they are also frequently provided in both resource rooms and general education classrooms with collaboration between special education and general education classroom teachers. Many different developments brought about this change, including parental advocacy, legislation, and litigation. The federal government played a major part in the evolution of special education services, primarily through legislation, litigation, and funding. Public Law 94-142, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, literally opened the doors of public schools and general education classrooms to students with disabilities. Under PL 94-142, now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, or IDEA, schools are required to seek out and implement appropriate educational services for all students with disabilities, regardless of the severity, to provide appropriate individualized services to students with disabilities, and to actively involve parents in the educational process. Since its original passage in 1975 as PL 94-142, IDEA has been reauthorized by Congress several times. Though each reauthorization has made changes in the original law, the basic requirements have remained relatively intact. The primary components of PL 94-142 and all future revisions includes providing free and appropriate public education for all students in the least restrictive environment and development of an annual individualized education plan for students identified with a specific disability. In 1990, this law was changed to Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. I will refer to the law as IDEA for the remainder of the presentation. Students with the following identified disabilities are protected under IDEA: intellectual disability, specific learning disability, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, visual impairments including blindness, orthopedic impairments, other health impairments, autism, traumatic brain injury, speech or language disabilities, deaf and blindness, developmental delay, deafness, and multiple disabilities. I am going to briefly discuss the three primary tenets of IDEA. As you may already recognize, the field of special education is inundated with acronyms. Acronyms must be used carefully, and professionals should not assume that parents understand all acronyms. It is important that educators speak in sensitive terms in order for all participants to feel as an equal partner. A free and appropriate public education means that all children are entitled to a public education that meets their needs. If a student is unable to participate in the public school setting as determined by the educational team, then the school district is required to fund a private placement, whether it is a residential placement or in a private setting that best meets the student's needs. All students have the right to be educated in the least restrictive environment. In most cases, the least restrictive environment is the general education classroom at the student's home school. The least restrictive environment is the setting where a child with a disability can receive an appropriate education designed to meet his or her educational needs alongside peers without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. Simply put, removal of a child with disabilities from the regular education class may occur only if the child cannot be satisfactorily educated in the regular educational environment with the use of supplementary aids and services. A child's placement is determined each and every year, is based on the child's IEP, is as close as possible to the child's home, and places the child in the school he or she would normally attend if not disabled. Every child who receives special education services must have an individualized education plan, or IEP. The purpose of the IEP is to detail reasonable learning goals and what services the child will receive from the school district. IEPs are legal documents that must contain the student's present levels of performance, annual goals, addressing all areas of deficits, which include academic, social, vocational, self-help, fine and gross motor skills, and behavioral areas, services, and any assessment results. The IEP team consists of the student, if appropriate, parents, administrator, educational specialist, general education teacher, and all other service providers involved in the child's education. IEPs are developed annually, but the team may meet more frequently in order to discuss the student's progress. In 1990, legislators included autism and traumatic brain injury to the list of disabilities covered under IDEA. The title of the law was changed from Education for All Handicapped Children Act to Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Schools were now required to implement transitional services beginning at age 16. In 1997, schools were now required to initiate transitional services no later than age 14 and required to include behavior intervention plans for students with behavior problems. The most recent revision of IDEA in 2004 aligns IDEA with the No Child Left Behind Act, or NCLB. With the reauthorization of IDEA in 2004, new policies are in place to further protect the civil rights of students, families, and educators. I will detail some of the primary changes. Schools are able to apply up to 15% of federal IDEA money to support students who are in general education and not identified with a specific disability. This includes response to intervention or RTI services and other remedial services in order to support students who fall between the cracks in our educational system. By aligning with NCLB, special education teachers are required to be highly qualified as measured by their certification and licenses. Public schools must hire teachers who already possess their special education credential or who hold an internship credential. Another example of this criteria in action is the recent addition of the Autism Authorization Program. Teachers who receive their mild-moderate specialist credential prior to 2011 are required to return to school and obtain this additional certification in order to be qualified to work with students with autism. Current special education credential programs embed the Autism Authorization certification within their program. Another example of this law is the requirement for teachers to return and receive the CLAD certificate in order to be qualified to work with students identified as English language learners. Prior to 2004, statewide assessment results of students who identified with mental retardation or intellectual disabilities were not included in school assessment reports. Now, students identified with intellectual disabilities are provided with an opportunity to complete an alternative assessment aligned with extended state standards in order to meet their growth and be part of the state accountability system. Changes in transitional services include the introduction of a 3-year educational plan focused on post-secondary goals beginning at age 16. It is the school's responsibility to help prepare the student and their family and provide a plan for life after high school. This may include future schooling, independent living, or a work program. As general education teachers, it is common practice to have one or more students with an IEP in your classroom. Although the student will have a specialist to support their education, you will be the primary teacher and influence during their educational year. As a general education teacher, you will assist in identifying students with learning, behavior, or other needs serious enough to seek input from colleagues. You will systematically implement interventions in your classroom to determine if the student's difficulties require further exploration. This is known as RTI. If the student is referred to special education, you will provide information on the student's academic and social functioning within your classroom and help identify the student's strengths and weaknesses. You will collaborate and communicate with professionals and parents in order to foster a team environment. Finally, you will implement the student's IEP within your classroom, instructing the student with his or her general education peers and applying any accommodations or modifications as outlined in the IEP. I hope you found this presentation informative. It by no means covers every facet of the law. Rather, it is meant to encourage you to complete further research in order to better understand the civil rights of those we serve.